Welcome to Unit 3, Lesson 7 on natural monopoly and price discrimination. These are two more applications that we'll do with this monopoly concept, and this will finish out our study of monopoly. So these are two kind of specific situations that we'll use the monopoly model again to analyze. So the first is called natural monopoly. See the question I put over here on the right of the slide. What if, in some situations, it would be more beneficial to society for an industry to be controlled by a monopoly compared to if it were competitive? Could it be possible for an industry to be, for it to be better for society for that to be the case? So if you think about it, I'm going to give you a couple examples. There's not a whole lot of these, but there's some significant examples. So the best one in my mind is water and plumbing and waste services. So both the water coming into your home and the waste going out of your home in the pipes. Just think about if there were a competitive market for that, what would need to happen? Well, assuming that the competitive companies wouldn't share the pipes running underneath the houses and underneath the streets and going out to the sewers and to the wastewater treatment plants and so on, there would be multiple layers of piping underneath the streets. There would be a lot more infrastructure. The infrastructure that needs to exist now, to have it just by one company is pretty big. Just imagine the work of trying to put in double or triple or more of that. It just wouldn't work. Another one that works pretty well is electricity. Most electricity comes to our home through power lines, which are strung through either overhead or underneath the street again. Once again, having more than one company putting those through, you can see how that would be pretty inefficient pretty quickly, would be more costly to society. Basically, these things are much more useful to be done by a single company. So now the downside is if it's a single company having a monopoly over it, we know from our study of monopoly that there's a on consumer surplus. Usually consumer surplus is less in a monopoly situation because the firm is able to increase the price by reducing the quantity. And we wouldn't want that, especially with these basic kind of services, which in a society everybody needs to have. So what happens with a situation like this is that the government regulates. The government allows, city governments usually, allows a single firm to have a monopoly over this kind of service, and then they regulate what price they can charge. Typically, it's done by price. So that the company makes enough of a profit to stay in business, to cover their opportunity costs, to make a normal profit, but doesn't make so much that it reduces the benefit to society, reduces the consumer surplus compared to what it would be in a more competitive market. So what you see going on in these graphs are basically two graphs of a natural monopoly with different regulated prices. The thing that makes these graphs a natural monopoly, you need to be able to recognize this because sometimes the AP test likes to throw one of these on there and recognize what makes a graph a natural monopoly graph. It all comes down to this ATC curve. Notice what's different about this ATC curve is that it's continuously decreasing throughout the relevant portion of the demand curve. You know it's going to keep decreasing because it hasn't hit marginal cost yet. So ATC is decreasing throughout the relevant demand. So through the whole demand curve. That's what makes it a natural monopoly. If you go back and look at our previous monopoly graphs, that's different from what you see on those. The ATC starts increasing at some point in the demand curve, and you get the typical, as you increase output, then the cost of producing it increases. But if you have a good that's a natural monopoly, it's going to get cheaper and cheaper the more and more quantity they sell. You know, once you lay the pipes, once you put the electric lines up there, the marginal cost of producing additional ones, your average total cost, huge fixed cost and a relatively low marginal cost, so your average total cost is going to keep falling all the way through the market. So that's what a natural monopoly graph is going to look like. The ATC is decreasing all the way through. So the one we have on the left, as you see, it says this is with an unregulated natural monopolist. Since it's unregulated, we know how they'll find their profit maximizing price and quantity without anybody telling them how to do so. MR equals MC is the quantity, QM. Really take this up to the price, up to the demand curve for the price, PM. can show their profit, like the book has here, the profit box, and then up here is the area of consumer surplus. Unregulated, that's a fairly small quantity compared to, they didn't show this, but right here would be the competitive quantity, if you see for the competitive quantity. So you can see there's a pretty big area of deadweight loss. We would call this the deadweight loss, and the government doesn't want to just allow a single company to do that, especially if it's something that's as basic a service as water or electricity. So the government has, and the courts have found the government has a compelling enough interest here to intervene in the market, to basically not allow any more than one company to work in this market, and to regulate that company so that they charge a certain price. And what they'll typically do to regulate, or what you most usually often see in textbook anyway, but it's more complicated this in real life, is that they will regulate them by saying you can charge the break-even price. Remember that the break-even price on these monopoly graphs is where ATC crosses the demand curve. So if they charge that break-even price, here's the regulated price, and here's the quantity that will be sold. Remember, breaking even means they're breaking even in terms of economic profits, but there are accounting profits. So when we break even, we're going to say, again, positive accounting profits, zero economic profit. We also call this a normal profit. It allows the firm to make a normal profit to stay in business. And with this, of course, they're selling a much higher quantity than they would be, not quite the competitive quantity, but a much higher quantity than they would be with the unregulated monopoly. The consumer surplus grows quite a bit. You can see that very easily. There's no profit area in this graph because they're not making a profit in terms of economic profit. They're breaking even. So it's a better situation all around. And we could say that it's even better than if we were to have a competitive market here, because then even though the consumer surplus would be very high, what would happen if we left this up to a competitive market, if more than one firm tried to get in here? Well, what we'd have is the firms would be losing money. The ATC is above price at that point. Firms would be losing money in a market where there's such high fixed costs. Firms just wouldn't enter in the first place. These services would not get provided without the government guaranteeing a firm to be able to have the market to themselves, even at low profit. So one other way you see this in real life is that if you're looking at different sectors in the stock market, the utilities, these are water, electricity are known as utilities. Utility stocks, they're things that they're private companies. And they're publicly bought and sold. They make profits, but they make relatively low profits. So utilities are generally considered to be pretty safe, stable, not a high return, but also not a high risk kind of stock. So that kind of fits the whole story too. One more thing to mention about this: there used to be more natural monopolies than this. Notice I didn't say phone service. AT&T was broken up as a natural monopoly, or as an actual monopoly for long distance service in the 70s, I believe. In any case, phone service, think about it with landlines, with the phone wires strung through the cities, used to be a natural monopoly type situation as well. But with the advent of cell phones, that is no longer. Same with the U.S. Postal Service. The U.S. Postal Service used to be a natural monopoly. Government really was the only one who could provide it. And at this point, UPS and FedEx, with better technology, have been able to come in and to compete. The Postal Service has not been regulated to keep out that competition. They didn't see the need, but that's hurt them at this point, and it's kind of too late to back off because the Postal Service is bleeding money. Anyway, that's the natural monopoly concept. Next, we've got price discrimination. We've talked about price discrimination before. Back when we talked about elasticity. So remember, this should be a review over here on the right. Price discrimination means simply charging different prices to different consumers. You see this in a lot of ways with, say, student discounts or senior discounts, where you're trying to charge a higher price to the consumers with more inelastic demand, people who are more willing to pay more for it. We want to charge them the higher price. We charge the lower price to those who might not buy it if it's a high price, people with more elastic demand. So, for instance, senior citizens, discounts, typically senior citizens on more constrained budgets, maybe more picky, that's generalization, but about, say, a movie, there's more young people who would be more likely to see it no matter what. So the strategy would be to charge lower price to the senior citizens who would have more elastic demand, higher price to those with more inelastic demand, people out on dates or whatnot. So how that could look with a monopoly is pretty interesting. So what we have over on the left-hand side, we have, what if a monopoly were able to charge two different prices? So here's the high price that it charges to this group of consumers, Q0 to Q1. Those are the consumers who are willing to pay this high price. It's going to charge the high price to that many of them. And then it's going to also charge this lower price, somehow if it can figure out a way to segment the market and get them to pay different prices, to this group of consumers from Q1 to Q2. That group of consumers is going to get to pay the low price. And so the profit for the monopoly from Q0 to Q1, they're getting this revenue, here's their cost, here's their profit. And then from Q1 to Q2, they're getting this revenue, there's their cost, and there's their profit on Q1 to Q2. So their total profit there is more than if they had charged just a single price, either P high or P low. If they charged P high, then their whole profit would just be this. They would only sell Q1. And if they just charged P low, their whole profit would just be this flatter rectangle. They wouldn't get that piece of the profit up here that they get from charging the higher price, the second price. So that's a graphic analysis of how price discrimination can work, and we put it with monopoly just because it's the simplest situation. When it's a monopoly over the market, they can just charge, here's one price, here's another. And the second graph shows the more prices that the monopoly can charge, the more ways they can figure out how to segment the market and charge people different prices, then the more profit they can make. So if they were able to add a third price, P high, P medium, P medium only starts there, and then P low, and it makes even more profit on it. So the more it can price discriminate, the more profit it's going to make, and the less consumer surplus. So increase price discrimination, we increase profit for the monopoly, and we decrease consumer surplus. We're transferring consumer surplus over to monopoly profits. So obviously not as good for consumers. Whether it's better or worse for society, it's kind of, if the monopoly profit is something that is a producer surplus, it's just transfer of surplus, really. The best overall for society is when it's at the competitive level, which is not in either of these situations. But here's an interesting one more scenario here, a perfectly price discriminating monopoly. What that means is, what if the firm could charge every consumer exactly his or her willingness to pay? This demand curve tells us that there's some people who are willing to pay this price. Somebody is, anyway, say maybe one person. And then there's another one who's willing to pay this price, and so on. What if the monopoly was able to charge every consumer exactly his or her willingness to pay? Then if we could infinitely segment the quantities in this market, what would happen is that the profit would be this entire triangle here, because they get this profit off of the first consumer, this profit off the second consumer, this profit off the third, and so on. So all the way down, this entire triangle, which in a competitive market would yield the same quantity, but this would entirely be consumer surplus. So if this were this is consumer surplus in a competitive market, in a perfectly competitive market. But it's all monopoly profit for a perfectly price discriminating monopoly. Does this kind of thing actually exist? Probably not. The closest that we get is with auction scenarios where somehow they're able to tease out the willingness to pay for every consumer. car sales, this is what they're trying to do. You pay a lot of different prices for cars, and what the car sales person is trying to do is tease out your willingness to pay and get you to pay that. Obviously, those are not monopolies, so it's not exactly like this, but there's a situation where there's lots of different prices going on in the market, depending on your willingness to pay. Ticket sales, StubHub, again, teasing out your willingness to pay in a lot of different ways by different prices of seats that are available. So in any case, this is a rare situation, but you might see it come up, a perfectly price discriminating monopoly, where the entire thing is monopoly profit. And one more thing to mention is, in this situation, the demand is the same as the marginal revenue curve. The additional revenue that the monopoly gets for selling an additional unit is exactly equal to the price that they get, because they're able to charge that price to the consumer without dropping any of the other prices before it. So you might see that come up. Okay, that finishes those two special and interesting, I think, hopefully you do too, cases. I'll see you in class.